everybody. Thank you all for being with us for the budget retreat today. So we'll call the meeting to order. And we've got a lot of information to cover and work through. So, but thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to Avril to help us get started.
Thanks, Chairman Newman. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again as we kick off our 2025 budget planning session. This year it's going to be a little different. Heather is going to be mostly our facilitator today, but we're going to do a little bit different this year instead of your priorities, because we believe your priorities have always been affordable housing, early childhood, public safety. So those are baked into our budget. Today, what we want to focus on is around some more long-term capital needs and capital plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to John, who's trying to get his budget to move.
Yes, it says yes. There we go. Welcome. So yes, as Avril said, we have a focus on long-range planning today. And I'm just going to talk through our agenda. We'll begin our morning with a discussion on capital projects led by our General Services Project Manager, Ron Lunsford, and Budget Analyst, JHP. Then Sustainability Project Manager Jackie Hamstead will talk about vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. Our Finance Director, Melissa Moore, will facilitate discussion on reserves. We plan to break for lunch, and I will follow up with recurring expenditures and revenues. Afterwards, we'll have a few updates for you, and then we'll conclude with a recap. We've carved out time at the conclusion of each of these sessions for our strategy and innovation folks to have some focused discussion and to gather feedback from you at the conclusion of each of our sessions. So with that, I will hand it over to Jay and Mike.
All right. So first off, thank you all for being here. Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about capital and the planning portions that go into it. So we'll dive right in and start with what really drives the capital plan for Buncombe County over the last three or 4 years. You all have seen these assessments and plans before, but we wanted to kind of walk back through them just as a refresher. On the left, you'll see the different buckets that lead to different projects for various departments. Starting at the top, the various assessments that lead to general services projects. Then the EMS assessment leads to projects for that group. And then your county strategic plan that leads to additional projects. And then coming in the future is recreation greenways, open space master plan. That's being conducted right now. So we expect to see future things coming out of that assessment. And with that, we'll go to the next slide and we'll dive a little deeper into each of these departments. So general services, like was on the previous side, the comprehensive facility plan, the library assessment, and the detention center assessment, and the community center assessment were performed either by general services or with the help of a third-party consultant. And those top four items there are renovation and repairs to each of those different facilities that arose from that plan. We started that by looking at exterior envelopes, structural needs, mechanical, electrical, plumbing issues, and all the way down to interior finishes. And that's what has really helped us know what we need to do to keep our facilities running and operating properly in the future. Other things that came out of those, a portion of those assessments was space management and utilization. How are we utilizing our buildings and our land? So you'll see at the bottom there some projects that came from that portion, such as the storage facility. That'll be a new building on county land. It's already owned at the old landfill, and it will help us take storage out of prime downtown real estate. West Asheville multifunctional building. We're doing a study in conjunction with Asheville City Schools, looking at that property and trying to determine what's best for both entities and how to utilize that. Recreation facility, as that storage at Allport gets vacated and folks move to other buildings to better utilize them. Recreation services would be the only department left in that huge building. So the plans would, we should build them a new facility for their offices at the sports park. It's land we already own, and it's where they spend the majority of their time. And then the ag facility is another one where we were looking at getting out of leased properties. We currently lease the building from Buncombe County Schools that Ag Services uses. So it's just one that's in the future, but on the plan nonetheless. Moving on to emergency services projects. So as emergency services did their assessment of their operations, really looking to reduce call times for Buncombe County citizens, led to a local and regional base model for that group. So there are local bases and regional bases that need to be constructed. One note on these is the West Asheville multifunctional building includes a look into what a EMS base makes sense there. So some of these things may change depending on whether or not the analysis says it can fit on that property and it makes sense to be on that property. So those can both move around and go up or down based on what comes of that. Next, we have a few things that are not necessarily from an assessment, but get added to the CIP based on need. We see public safety core software systems. That would be to upgrade the communication software for 911. And then 911 facility, a portion of that is from the facility assessment we did that pointed out the conditions that need to be addressed in that building. And then a portion is the need for 911 to expand in the facility they're in. So that's how it ends up in that bucket. Next, we have recreation services projects. So while they are underway with a master plan, they know a few things that they'd like to see happen already. So those get added here. Owen Park pickleball courts. Pickleball is growing rapidly. So we'd look at adding some of those at that facility for youth. And then new playground equipment at the sports park. With the new turf fields, that area is getting a lot of use and the playground equipment is due to be replaced. And then lastly, additional projects, things that come from your strategic plan and just additional items. See voting system replacement, as technology changes, we need to stay with the times. So those kind of things make it onto CIP. And you see solar panel installations, active aging center, and some I-26 infrastructure. With that, and
All right.
over to Jay.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Sir.
So now that you've heard about all the projects on our current CIP, we also wanted to highlight that there's other projects or sources of projects that haven't yet been submitted through our capital process and haven't yet made it onto our CIP that may become future capital projects. So the list on this slide is not intended to be comprehensive, but is meant to capture most of the major potential future capital projects that we have heard discussion about around the county and that may come onto our CIP in the future in some form or fashion. So looking through the list, some of these items are actual specific projects, such as Beaver View Mountain, the potential county park under exploration, the proposed Ferry Road development that has open space and affordable housing components, a low barrier shelter, fleet electrification, and the Cox Avenue, Valley Street, and Irwin Hills properties that DFI is looking at for affordable housing. While other items on this list are more sources for future projects, like the new capital requests for fiscal year 25 and beyond that, we actually just closed the request process for departments on November 17th. So those requests are currently undergoing our capital review process at this time. So we'd expect to see probably some additional things to our CIP through that. The recreation greenways and open space master plan that Ronnie mentioned, he mentioned it's ongoing currently. So we'd expect to see some recommendations for capital projects through that plan as well as future open space GO bond projects and affordable housing GO bond projects, of which there's still around 55 million in bond proceeds still yet to be appropriated for specific projects there. So the actual form or financial impact that these projects, this list of projects may eventually have on our future CIP is yet to be determined, as they're all in various stages of development and haven't yet gone through our capital review process, which is why we're not including any potential costs on this slide. However, we want to make sure to highlight these as important future considerations to keep in mind alongside the current CIP that we just discussed. So as you think about long-term capital planning for the county. So now with those additional considerations in mind, moving back to our current CIP, the chart on the screen details the costs of our current CIP annually broken out by departmental category. Costs shown each year are total project costs. So for example, if a project for a new facility slated in FY25 costs $50 million, all those costs would hit in that FY25 column. And we do that because we adopt the CIP by project. In your materials, you should also see a more detailed CIP as well as a list of project descriptions as well. So if you want some more detail. In FY24, we have adopted just shy of 42 million in capital projects, with a large chunk coming from general services projects such as renovation and repair to the county courthouse, renovating the 35 Woodfin Street building for our forward-facing departments to be placed in one location, and beginning design on the new storage facility that Ronnie mentioned at the site of our old landfill to centralize storage across our county departments. Looking past FY24, as we go into the future years, we see significant planned growth in capital with around 116 million slated in FY25 and around 74 million in FY26. I should note that all the costs on the CIP, particularly as we go further out in the planned years, are estimates and are less reliable the further out we get, given any changes that could happen in scope or economic environment or any new priorities, opportunities, or challenges that may arise between now and then. So for example, as Ronnie mentioned, on the CIP in FY25 is that West Asheville multifunctional building. And so there's still a lot of planning underway on that. He mentioned that in the descriptions that you have, it includes potential for a construction of an EMS space, and we have a separate EMS space project as well in FY25. So there may be, depending on how planning goes there, may be opportunity for cost savings or efficiencies between the two projects. As we look forward, we see a large chunk of costs in FY25 stemming from general services projects again, which is largely that West Asheville building project that we just talked about, as well as construction for the new storage facility, which we're doing design in this fiscal year. While costs from fiscal year 26 and onward into FY27, 28, we see a large growth from emergency services projects, which are those EMS facilities that Ronnie covered, recommended by the EMS assessment, including an emergency operations center and 3 regional bases. Further out, we also see general services projects stemming from the comprehensive facility assessment, including that new parks building in FY27 and a new ag and land building for ag and land department in FY28. So on the previous slide, we saw the CIP broken out by total project cost, as I mentioned, but really the impact to the general fund is probably best measured on an annual basis by our debt service costs. Since historically the county has primarily funded capital projects, particularly larger capital projects like new construction or major renovations with debt financing. Trade-offs of that approach versus using cash or pay-go will be covered in further detail in our reserves discussion that we'll have later on in this retreat. The chart on this slide details historical and potential debt service costs based on if the county were to issue debt to fully fund the current CIP that we just talked about, as well as the already approved GEO bond projects, of which there's about $15 million appropriated currently. So historically, the debt service has cost the county around $20 million. You can see, in FY21, 22, 23, 24, it's all around that $20 million mark. And if you actually go back, it's been around that for years preceding this as well. Another way to quantify that is, as a rule of thumb, a penny of the tax rate equals around $5 million. So that would equate to about 4 cents of the tax rate that we've traditionally spent on debt service. As you can see, as we go further out in our projections, we are projecting that potential debt service may increase up to around 42 million in FY27 and up to 45 million in FY29, which is more than double our, historical levels of spending. Another way to think about that is if we've historically budgeted that 4 cents of the tax rate that I mentioned, then we would need to budget 9 cents of the tax rate to meet the increased demands in FY29. Again, more than double the historical rate of spending. As we detail further in the recurring expenditures discussion that John will lead, revenues like property tax and sales tax aren't, growing at close to that same rate. So that would mean around the equivalent of 5 cents on the tax rate that we would need to either find in revenues or reduce in departmental or operational spending to cover those costs in FY29. And I know that FY29 is a couple years away, but I would also note that even looking closer in FY25, we are projecting we would need to find the equivalent of an additional 1 cent on the tax rate to either find in revenues or reduce departmental or operational spending elsewhere as well. So in addition, these projections don't include, like I mentioned, that the 55 million in GEO bond proceeds that have yet to be appropriated for those affordable housing and open space bonds, which would need to be appropriated by fiscal year 2030, as well as any of the future projects that we had discussed on that previous slide. So as we mentioned, the impacts of those are difficult to quantify at this moment, given that they're all in various stages of development. But however, I think it's safe to say that adding any of those projects on top of our current CIP would only add to our debt service burden above the projections that we see on this slide. Any questions on anything we've covered so far? You can stop for that this moment. Okay. I think the next portion is a discussion, and I'll hand it off to Heather to lead that.
So to kind of get your brains moving a little bit, I'd like to hear from you. And I'm curious to know what key points you noted around the capital project information that was shared, either the capital projects or the budgeting. Anyone can jump in. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Terry, because one of the concerns I have when we look ahead, we're basing it on the income we have coming in now from taxes and all. But I do hope that we're allowing a cushion where if it doesn't work, I mean, if the taxes don't go up, or heaven forbid, they start going down, the sales taxes and all, that we will be protected. We'll have a cushion there to make it, to make sure that we don't have to make deep cuts. I have to put on my banking hat now because I am a physical conservative when it comes to dollars. But I just want us to be careful and not overextend ourselves in the future.
What other key points?
the FY29 has to construct from that year. That's something we should be talking about.
Great point.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of stating the obvious, I guess, but like, these are multiple big projects, right? So this is doing a lot more capital investment than we've traditionally done, right? So, and there's rationales for each of these projects. Some of them are, more fleshed out, others are more conceptual, right? So, but I think it's a great presentation to kind of outline, here's the ideas that are on the table, right? And then, to start the discussion more around, all right, now that we see the estimated price tag on these realistically, okay, so a lot of great ideas out there. How would we pay for this? And to really start kind of going through each one and say, yes, we feel like that, that makes sense, that's justified, that's an important priority, let's do it, and let's figure out how to pay for it, because yeah, in all likelihood, the current revenue structure won't do, right? So we're either talking, and we're not, and I don't think, I mean, there's always places we can look at trimming, tightening, things like that, but there's not somewhere in the existing budget to go find that much money, right? So we'd have to think about some sort of revenue strategy on it in terms of, realistically, we control the property tax rate, right? There are some other things out there in the future, sales taxes that will be changing in the future that could be looked at, but I think this is a good way to kind of start the conversation around over the next several years, what is the plan? And how much, and then when we look at the revenue options of what we're willing to do, then how much of this can we afford? And maybe we decide we can afford and we have to invest in every single one of those projects, or maybe we start, setting some priorities within the overall list. That's kind of my high level thoughts.
Yeah, what this also tells me is that we have not focused enough on our internal infrastructure in terms of capital planning, which has gotten us to this point. So the sticker shock is pretty high, but it's high time we look at these things. And then to take that just a step further, for me, being able to prioritize these projects in terms of what is critical to address the needs across Buncombe County, and the residents that live here. So what are those high priority projects that keep us up at night versus the nicer to have? So I think some really in-depth conversations about that's going to be important moving forward.
Any other thoughts?
My colleagues have said it well.
Wonderful. So now I'm curious to hear from anyone that wants to chime in. And some of you have alluded to this, but where do you feel that capital budgeting moving forward is going to be difficult versus where do you think it might be more straightforward?
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite follow the question.
Yeah, what,
So if we think about the slide deck, the projects, the cost of these projects, where do you want to hone in and focus on some areas that you think are going to be more difficult than others? And where do you think it's a given, right? If we know that, for example, we need to focus on infrastructure, do we go ahead and start trying to prioritize those items? Just curious to know your thoughts, where it's going to be difficult or straightforward, where you'd like to focus.
I think one issue, I think it would be one issue I would want us to just be elevating is services, essential services, especially related to public safety, like issues. Obviously the long-term facility needs related to feels to me like a non-negotiable. It's painful to think about having to deprioritize that. But get to a place where we have to make hard decisions, things that are about ensuring our community is safe, and that we're providing the essential services we're required to rise to the public.
Thank you.
On the flip side of that too, also. If they arise in our community, we'll also, I think, have to balance out the whole picture of it. Yeah, knowing when we may have to change course, when something unexpected happens.
And I'd like to commend the staff for bringing all of this forward for us to discuss. Because in the past, I think that's a problem we've had. Is that we haven't done a good job of discussing what we need in the future, you know, something I'm talking about even before I was here. I think sometimes we were going at whoever made the loudest noise, that's who we take care of. But we can't afford that anymore. And I think it's basics, quality of life, when we look at, you know, making things better for our constituents in Buncombe County. And that's where I agree with what Jasmine said and several others. You know, we've got to look at things like EMS. We've got to think about pre-K. These are some of the things we have, you know, that we know we've got to do to make life better for the people who live here. But on the other hand, we've got to also look at now, do we need these bells and whistles, or can we do without, or can we put things off? I think that's critical, because doing all of this, one thing we've got to do, we've got to continue to look at the tax rate, because that's going to be critical, I think.
Just from a process standpoint, you know, I mean, I know these are obviously issues that everybody in the commission is very interested in and wants to be meaningfully engaged in. I mean, if we are looking at a scenario where we, you know, we might be doubling the amount of debt service that we're investing annually to go do a whole lot of new projects, you know, a lot more projects than we have been launching, you know, over the last 5 or 10 years, then, and maybe this would be on, I don't know, maybe more of an ad hoc basis, and it's just an idea, but, you know, we have these other capital committee groups that we work with on the schools, both AB Tech and the city and county schools. I think those have served us really well, because in the past, you know, prior to that, these big projects would come forward and the commission would say, you know, like, oh my gosh, like this is so expensive, right? And have we really thought this through, and have we really explored alternatives? And so, you know, these committees have really helped do that, where we have a dedicated group with our partners to look at these projects in detail and spend an hour or two, you know, on a regular basis thinking these things through. So when it comes to the whole commission for discussion, you know, there's been that process, because we have to be realistic about how much bandwidth we have in our county commission meetings to dedicate to all these kinds of issues. So I guess just as a thought would be to maybe think about forming a subset of the commission to work on our own capital projects, right? To kind of look at these in more detail. It might be hard because I know everyone wants to do that, right? But in some cases, if we don't do it there, then we don't do it at all, right? Because we're just, you know, we need to be realistic about how much time we'll have in our regular commission meetings to really take the deep dive on these. So just a process thought.
Any other thoughts? So any lingering questions or anything else you'd like to discuss around capital?
I guess the one other question I have now on the the EMS facilities, the new EMS facilities. How far along is the planning around those potential projects?
So, you know, the EMS assessment is complete and we're currently in design for one of the EMS local bases. And then next FY I've asked for design to start the next one. And then construction to complete the one that's currently in design. So they are moving forward. Since once the assessment for EMS was complete, it got the ball rolling on this.
And which one is the one currently?
Currently in design.
Yes.
That'll be the East Asheville one. It's just down the road here in Owen, or yeah, it's on an Owen community.
And then, but then the second one is the potential West Asheville.
Correct.
Where the school is currently.
Mhm.
Which
So,
we're,
the old school
which
site.
we are doing a mobile temporary.
Right.
At that facility
Right.
right now.
What's the status of the mobile temporary?
It's in design as well. Or it's really in like a schematic preliminary design, but it is moving forward. Cause it's. Don't write all. Yeah. Another one of our project managers is handling that one.
So there's the east, then there's the west,
Hmm.
temporary now, potentially a total rebuild.
Yep.
Right. And is there another one beyond that that's contemplated?
There,
When we vacate, when General Services vacates the McCormick location downtown by the field and moves to their new fleet complex, we will use that as an EMS space.
Right, so those are the three projects.
Mhm.
Other questions for now?
Okay. Thank you, Jay, Ron. Let's invite Jackie Hampstead up. She's going to discuss.
Hey, I do have one other maybe question, comment about capital, but it's not ours and directly. But, and I think I don't know if we've ever really talked about this in a commission meeting. I think there's been sort of informal conversations about it from time to time, right? So we've got our new project on the old landfill property for our storage, right? So the idea has been discussed from time to time about, because the city has similar needs, right? And the idea has been discussed, well, you know, they have all their facilities downtown too, right? Like taking up like large parts of like the most valuable property in Buncombe County. You know, maybe that made sense 30 years ago, but it's not the highest and best use of these properties going forward. You know, you could build tons of housing like near all these jobs and services, things like that. A lot of those projects are also tied up with like urban renewal history in Asheville as well. It's just, we should be planning for doing better for these parts of the community from a land use standpoint, community standpoint. But as we're seeing here, like moving these facilities and doing new facilities is really hard and expensive, right? And part of it's just finding the land to do it, right? So I just wanted to say, like, I think that we have, in some cases, just informally encouraged the city, like, hey, you know, we're going through some of this, you should look at this too, right? But maybe just as we're having this conversation, I would just like to say that to the extent that the county has land available that could potentially be a potential site for relocation of other public facilities in the community, as that could enable redevelopment of valuable downtown public properties in particular, that's something that I think we should be open to and encourage. Again, it would be like the city in this case, their decision about whether they want to take us up on that. They might decide that's not a good location for them for various reasons, but anyway, I just kind of wanted to say that out loud because we're putting a lot of work into redeveloping our downtown properties for affordable housing and other higher purposes. And if there's a way we can help partners in the community do that too, then I think that's that's something, that's an offer we ought to put out there.
Commissioner, you've actually raised that with us before, and we did reach out to the city on that. And I was just double checking my numbers. they had a facility study, and to relocate their downtown space, I believe they needed about 25 acres. We don't have that much left, but they're looking at the armory. Sure where the armory is located. But they do have space on the armory off of Patton Avenue that they're looking to reuse, so they will be looking as well.
And
do
that's the, when we talk about the armory, there's a couple of old armories. Is that the one at the park? At the Richmond Hill Park property, or which armory? Or
I think it's the maybe parcel next to it. I don't know about.
They own that. They have space as well.
that's not 25 acres, is it? Or anywhere? That's a tiny piece of property.
Certain chunks, so that was gonna be one. That's fine.
Yeah, well, I think our property is much larger than that. So space is the issue. I just, I mean, if they've, anyway, I just wanted to say that out loud and, okay.
Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Jack. He's gonna talk us through fleet budgeting and EV infrastructure.
Right, and this kind of segues from Jay's presentation a bit. It's just kind of a digging into one of those CIP projects. So quick overview, this is pretty straightforward. As our demand for services grows and our fleet grows, so do our capital and operating needs. So fuel, staff, parts and equipment and parking. Currently, our fleet is about 560 vehicles. Just over half are in the sheriff's department. Average age of our fleet is 7.3 years. That average age is younger for some of our like patrol vehicles. And then average mileage is 111,000. So there's some policy driving some of these decisions around fleet. We do the sustainable fleet policy, and the goal is to align procurement with strategic goals to transition to low emission vehicles. The county, as part of the policy, new county facilities will include EV charging infrastructure. But to make this transition, again, will require capital and operating investment. And so here on the right is just kind of where we are in the process of electrifying our fleet. We currently have 5, we have 6 on order that should be here this month. And then we've also had more EV orders canceled than we've received. So we're trying to make progress there. So the impacts to our fleet budget. So here's like a quick 3-year look back on the adopted budget for vehicles every year. You can see there's a bit of variation from year to year, which makes some long-term planning a little challenging. And then on the far right, we have a draft replacement cycle. These are pretty conservative numbers. So 10 years for general government vehicle, 6 years for ambulances, and 4 to 7 for sheriff vehicles, depending on the use. But the kind of the key takeaway from this slide is that if we just to maintain a draft replacement schedule, not to replace wrecked vehicles, not to add to our fleet, that price tag is around 5.75 million if we want to follow this draft replacement schedule, which will have us replacing about 80 vehicles a year. I do want to mention that a big piece of this is inflation. Vehicle inflation is outpacing the rest of the market. So in the past 4 or 5 years, vehicle prices have gone up 32%. So the new cost of a vehicle is $11,000 more than it was 4 or 5 years ago. And if you're replacing 80 plus vehicles a year, plus the rising cost of upfits, that's like $1 million just to cover the cost of inflation from a few years ago.
Jackie, did you say something about vehicles getting canceled early on?
Supply chains have been a challenge. I think we're on the back end of looking at Mike Mace. I think we're kind of getting to the other side of that. But yeah, we've had to make some, when we need a vehicle, we need a vehicle. We can't say we'll delay it 2 years until we get an EV or a hybrid. So yeah, that's been a challenge.
Thank you.
The other big piece of this puzzle is EV infrastructure costs. So we currently do have 32 EV chargers spread across 10 locations in the county. But we do want to have plans to kind of have these two big charging hubs at the college and Cox decks. Upfront cost for those is $425,000 for college and $421 at the Cox deck. Now is a good time to start doing these projects because there are some incentives available. So both of these projects are in qualified census tracts where we can apply for the 30% federal rebate. So that's a big cost savings, over $100,000 for each of these projects. And then we would also probably take advantage of Duke's one-time incentive program as well for one of the projects. And that's it, short and sweet.
So, do folks have any questions about anything specifically that they saw in the slide deck before we move into some broader questions?
And I guess part of the point of having the EV chargers in these two decks is beyond public use, but also for our own vehicle, our fleet.
The primary purpose of those two projects would be for fleet vehicles, correct? There are publicly available chargers existing and we like to keep those public and then, yeah, just.
Okay, so the focus on these is fleet specific.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're gonna talk about EV stuff in more detail at our Energy and Environment Committee meeting tomorrow. So I won't spend too much time on it now, but just to maybe just briefly comment on why I think it's like, when we think about our sustainability goals, it's a really important priority for us to be focused on. You know, when we look at the climate goals, like around about a third of our needs will be met through what we do with renewable energy on the electrical grid. About a third is transportation, and then a third is like everything else. So the transportation piece is really huge. And it's really one of our best opportunities to, and not just, I don't just mean government, but more like society to go forward really fast, because we're now living in this era where like affordable EVs are with us, right? And most everyone has to have a car, right? Like people would like to put solar panels on their homes or buildings, but you know, you can get power another way, but everyone needs a car, right? And cars wear out and you have to make these decisions around what to buy. So in a community like ours, a lot of people, probably most people, will want to choose an EV, right? But these issues around the infrastructure to actually charge it ends up becoming a big barrier to a lot of people. Not everyone can do EV charging where they live, certain apartments or just the way their properties laid out, things like that. So the need to create an abundance of accessible EV charging unlocks a key barrier for our community to meet these goals. So just anyway, those are a few thoughts around and why I think it's an important thing for us to look at. What the role of local governments is to do that, I think is still kind of unclear, right? This is we're all just kind of living into this, right? This is sort of a new thing, but we may have a really important role to play in that, because right now there's only a few fast charging stations in our whole community, right? Like it was the other way around, and we're trying to go from like, if everything was electric, but we wanted to go to gas, and it was like 2 gas stations in Buncombe County, people would be like, well, I'd like to buy gas, but there's only 2 gas stations and there's a long line every time I go there, right? So we need to think about, this is sort of a whole new kind of model that's being created and thinking about what our role is in that. But it may be that in the big picture, some fairly modest investments in helping to accelerate that build out could really help our community move a lot faster.
So those are some excellent points, and I'm just going to not read all that I have to get up. No, but it does kind of lead to where we wanted to take the conversation, which you just saw a big segment on capital planning, now fleet, infrastructure, electrification. There's a lot of intersectionality there. So in terms of future budgeting and planning, and you've already elaborated on this some, but I'd love to hear from others as well. How does this fit in with future planning for Buncombe County in terms of funding projects in this? Noting that it is an emerging space, technologically speaking, that there are, there's advancements happening in the private sector as well that we may be able to take advantage of. What are folks' thoughts?
I did just want to add to Chair's point that the projects at the parking garage aren't just about putting chargers up. The parking garages don't have enough electrical load to push the chargers. So you must So you must actually build in more electrical load in these buildings before you can have chargers. And that is one of the things that many people don't think about when you say, let's just put up a bunch of chargers and charge cars. So some facilities, when these parking garages were built, they were meant to put on some lights at night and maybe a couple charging stations. They weren't built that way. So part of that cost you're seeing is to be able to increase the electrical load just to be able to have the chargers there.
Good point. John.
Energy not cover some of that cost, like,
You did see that in some of the rebates coming back.
right?
But we actually, like, to build the load, I mean, that's part of the price tag of, that's a major part of the price tag of what you're seeing in this capital project.
If I could share my other smart ways, I guess if I had vacant land and I'm building a store on it, you would take work pretty necessary infrastructure to that property.
And that's entirely possible with a new construction, but we're trying to change, yes.
This one, that's, the very last thing you said about the private sector.
This is emerging space, so there's developments happening in the private sector, charging stations are popping up at all kinds of locations that we may be able to take advantage of. Jackie can speak more to this than I can, but WEX is potentially going to have availability of, you swipe a WEX card like we do with gas pumps.
Yeah, I think that's part of our plan for EV charging is that, and we will dig into this more tomorrow.
Right.
But yeah, is to utilize public charging infrastructure. And so WEX, just like our fuel cards work at a gas station, they work at a lot of EV charging stations.
So that's,
In addition, I think in combination, so we'll have these like kind of charging hubs, but it's particularly if you have like in the far future, if there's a patrol vehicle, you know, they need a lot of satellite charging locations that aren't just at the college and stuff.
right. So then the question is, you know, as far as future budgeting and planning, how do we leverage these strategies, like the availability of some of that private infrastructure, as well as our own public infrastructure to meet our needs for fleet electrification? So that's kind of the question we wanted to like pose to you folks to think about.
Well, I would say to me, since this is fleet, right, this seems like a really important investment for us to make. And when we can continue to leverage other funds that are coming in to continue to build out that infrastructure, that always makes good sense to me that we want to pull in and leverage other funds as much as we can.
Yep. All right, thanks. What's next?
So we're going to move into discussion from our new CFO, Melissa Moore. And she's going to talk to us about reserves.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Are y'all? I'm getting used to the cold weather. All right. All right. So again, Melissa Moore, the Finance Director. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. My segment of the presentation today will discuss reserves policy. So first, we'll talk about the need and the why for a reserves policy. We're going to dip into a little bit about the difference between fund balance and reserves, and then we'll talk about some best practices for fiscal sustainability. So as we look at kind of the current strategies that we have and that we utilize to fund our capital program, it is a combination between debt and cash. So debt allows you to spread that cost out over multiple years, but it also includes additional costs. So it's that cost of capital, the interest, to utilize those funds. When issuing debt, you also have to analyze whether you have capacity and affordability. So for the cash, the uses are to kind of pay as you go for the projects. It's been very inconsistent over the past several years. And we did have aspects in our fund balance policy to leverage some of that to transfer. So you'll see in my nifty little roadmap over to the side, some of the past years of history for kind of cash funding our capital program.
in fiscal year 22, there was a transfer to our capital fund of 16.6 million. Let's keep in mind that transfer is a result of the surplus from the prior year. So think about fiscal year 21. We were receiving lots of funding related to COVID support. Okay, so that is not a recurring funding source for us. Okay, that is not something that we will end up seeing, as you can see from the other points on the graph here. So fast forward to fiscal year 23. So we made some changes in our budget strategy to alleviate some of that year-end surplus in our fund balance, and it resulted in a transfer to capital of 1.8 million. So come to fiscal year 24, surplus from the prior fiscal year resulted in a 0% transfer. So that fund balance policy for that transfer comes to unassigned fund balance, which is a component of available fund balance. And it has to exceed 20% to trigger that automatic transfer. So this kind of leads us to the why. Why do we need to adopt and consider a reserves policy? Well, we need to close that gap. We need to, regardless of how we're utilizing funding, whether it's debt or cash, we need to come up with a policy on how we're going to be sustainable in supporting and funding our capital program long term and building for our future needs. So let's talk a little bit about understanding the difference between our fund balance and reserves. Okay, so your fund balance, this is really an accounting term. Okay, so it's your difference between your assets and your liabilities. Okay, so that's where we come up with that term of surplus. So it's the difference between the two, kind of falls to fund balance. Okay, so your fund balance is going to be a measure of your financial stability. Okay, it's your liquidity. That means that is the cash that you have on hand to work with to meet the need. Okay, that cash on hand is also going to serve during the seasonality of your revenue receipts. So over 60% of general fund revenue is collected in a very condensed amount of time instead of steady throughout the year, the way our expenditures go, right? So that fund balance and that liquidity cash on hand serves to continue to meet our needs throughout the year, right? Okay, so our fund balance policy is the available fund balance. So you'll see total fund balance. It's going to be a combination of several different types of fund balance, including restricted. Okay, so the fund balance policy is going to only speak to the available fund balance. So that policy is a minimum of 15% up to 20%. Okay, so what are we using fund balance for? Okay, and Commissioner Wells touched on it in some of her comments in the CIP segment, but fund balance is there to not only meet policy requirements and liquidity and measures, but it's also there to meet emergency needs. So when you have cash on hand, you have the ability to fund those needs in that moment, right? So your emergency needs, losses of revenue, declines in your economy. So any of those measures, public safety issues, COVID was a very unplanned public health emergency. So it's very important to have very strong reserves to give your community options to meet those needs in that moment. Okay, so what's the difference between a fund balance and a reserve? Well, a reserve is going to be a dedicated funding source to meet specific funding needs for the community. Okay, your reserve is going to be policy driven. Okay, it's a solution to help fund for our needs. It would be a solution to fund our capital program. Okay, you would have a budget line item, so it creates that funding capacity through a transfer. So it's not just the result of if we don't end up needing it, and that's how the fund balance transfer was triggered, is if we ended up having that additional surplus. Your reserve in this manner would be actually in the budget, and it would absorb some of that capacity out of your general fund to ensure that it's a dedicated funding source for accumulating savings for your capital program. So that funding would be used capital program, and more specifically, it's going to be like major repair and maintenance, increasing capital cost, fleet and items like that, things that really aren't appropriate to issue 20-year bonds and absorb that cost of capital for. So let's switch over and talk about some best practices. So in best practices, we're going to touch on three main pillars for fiscal sustainability. Okay, we're going to touch on capacity. So it's really the level of debt that your organization can issue without violating law, basically. So you got statutory law and you also have policies within the county. But capacity also, so we aren't triggering a downgrade on our credit rating. Talk more about each one of these in a little bit, but liquidity, it's really just the cash that you have on hand to meet your funding needs. And then affordability. So affordability, the degree to which your organization can commit to funding a capital program without increasing that burden to your community. So let's talk about each one of these a little bit. So when we start understanding a little bit more about the capacity, so you've got a legal component, right? So how much debt can we issue? Well, you have state and county debt policies that is really tied to your property assessed value. Okay, so a certain percent of that can be issued in debt. Okay, that applies to not only bonds that we're considering to issue to fund general fund projects, but it's for any debt that the county issues. So that is going to go into the capacity that we have to issue bonds. Okay, well, capacity also has a very strong credit rating consideration. So we currently have a AAA credit rating, highest credit rating. We're able to access the markets at the lowest interest rates possible, allow to capture that lower cost of capital and cost avoidance for our community to fund those items that we're funding through bond proceeds. Okay, so currently we have about 370 million of existing debt. Ongoing projects that we're currently working on, we have a pending of about 190 million of additional debt to issue. So potential CIP that we've discussed earlier this morning, and that could be up to about 320 million. So capacity, very serious consideration, because when you're looking at the options that you have to fund your capital program, it's either cash or debt, right? So capacity. So again, the level of debt that organization can commit to from a legal perspective and without triggering a downgrade on your credit rating.
Melissa, can you remind us what the percent is when you say for the state and the county's debt policy? What percentage is that?
I believe it's 3% of the assessed value.
3% of the assessed property value? Thank you.
So looking at liquidity. So liquidity is going to, again, have an impact on your credit rating. So your potential investors and your rating agencies are going to heavily look at that fund balance reserves. They'll add both of those together to all your liquidity and ratio metrics. Okay. So again, when I was talking about your fund balance, it's going to be a measure of your financial stability. So people that the investment community that we're considering to look at our bonds, the rating agencies that look at the same thing, they're going to look at our balance sheet and they want a strong, stable balance sheet. We currently have that. Our rating agency says so, right? Our AAA credit rating backs that. So we definitely want to continue to have very strong liquidity. It's a great thing to have. It's a measure of financial stability. Okay. So what are we doing with all that money? Well, right now we're in a high interest rate environment and we've invested it. It's very secure. We have an investment policy to ensure that it meets those safety needs, but also return on equity. So it's earning interest for us. It's working for us, right? Okay. So liquidity, cash on hand, it reduces our dependency on debt. So the more cash that we have available to pay go, if you will, means that we're not having to pay all that cost of capital for it.
Can I ask a question? What are the high level, like what are the interest rates we're getting now compared to say 3 or 4 years ago when we were in a very low interest rate environment?
I think we're looking at a little over 5%. 5.2. Oh, 2. Okay, so we're looking at about 5% now versus, and we have some previous bonds issued in the 2% range.
That's what we earn.
What we're earning is 5 currently. versus two where we were before.
Yeah, some of the accounts were even like lower than two.
Thank you.
So the liquidity is the cash on hand that we have to meet our funding needs. So now let's shift our focus over to the last pillar of our fiscal sustainability and look a little bit into affordability. So it's a very important aspect to help balance the whole fiscal puzzle, if you will, right? So affordability is going to impact the cost of living. So if we look at, for instance, 1 cent on our tax rate currently, that's going to generate $5 million of a funding source into our general fund. Like we look at the impact to quality of life. Let's take that 5 million that we generated from that 1 cent on our tax rate. And let's see the difference on how we apply it to fund our capital program. So 5 million can be contributed to fund our capital program through cash. Well, if we take that cash and invest it, we can put it in a pool account, we can put with our investment firms. That's going to generate interest. So you would be able to pay 5.25 million of your capital program needs. If you were to take that $5 million of that funding from the 1 cent on your tax rate and you were to debt fund it, you would be able to fund 2.6 million of the needs out of your capital program. To that other part of that 5 million, it goes to the cost of capital. Okay, so if you think about dollar for dollar of your capital program of what you're funding, debt service, it only funds a portion of that. The rest of it goes to the investment community that's their benefit of buying our bonds, right? So it comes down to balancing these two, and that's where it comes to an opportunity cost. So as Mr. Newman mentioned before, some of these really expensive projects, the community may have greater needs now. That might be the highest priority. Some of those larger projects, you need to issue debt for them. It's the right thing to do, right? So you are going to have to balance the two. So affordability is the degree to which the organization can commit to funding our capital program without increasing the burden to our community. So the next steps would be to further discuss the need for a reserves policy, for staff to go back and draft the reserve policy, for us to bring that recommendation back to you in March at our next budget workshop. And that concludes my presentation.
All right, thank you, Melissa. So I'd like to hear from each of you. What are some facts that you noted about the reserves conversation that Melissa just walked us through?
Well, to me, I definitely feel like we need for you all to come back to us and look at the reserves policy. So we have something like that. And I also really would like to see something about best practices of when we do the pay as you go versus going out for debt, so that we have some guidelines. And I think we discussed that in some detail last year during our budget thoughts around that. But I do think that would be something very beneficial for us to look at. So we have guidance around that.
Thank you.
I guess, a couple of initial thoughts. I mean, it sounds good, but also looking at all of these actual projects that are being contemplated and the amount of funding that's going to need to be dedicated to that and the pressure we'll put on us to raise taxes to do that. So I guess just one obvious concern is like, if there's also this proposal, it's like, okay, and there's this other new thing we're going to include in the budget called reserves. It's going to be on top of that we also have to come up for new money for. I mean, I like the idea, but I'm also just sort of thinking like, all right, like what I have already seen, like that we are mostly probably going to need to do, right? Like, because these are real buildings that have to get built, right? So just that it could be challenging to layer a new budget item on top of these other specific capital projects that we're talking about. So just
So
stating the obvious, but
clarification, maybe I misunderstand. I was thinking the intent was to have this reserves policy, so then that we have that consistent source that we use to fund this capital. Did I That was the
Okay,
way I
well,
was
let's
taking
clarify
it.
that, because that's not how I heard it.
Your both, right? The consistent source would be the reserve, but how you fund the reserve, I think is where Bounty is coming from. You would have to put money in your budget that gets set aside to start to grow a reserve policy. So the policy gives us the guidelines, but you have to fund that reserves. And to Brownie's point, that'll be another line item in our budget on top of these. So yes. So we will-
But maybe,
But-
is it, but right now, I mean, we fund vehicle maintenance, we fund building maintenance. But those line items are still going to be in the budget too, right? That's not gonna change. Nor the amounts associated with those, but now there's this new category called reserves. Which can be applied to those types of purposes, but is a bit more open-ended in terms of what the funds would actually ultimately be used for. And this is, right, am I hearing that correctly?
Well, it would be transferred out of the general fund into your capital program, right? So it would be a revenue source for your capital fund. And you would go through to determine what is the best use of those capital dollars. So it could be a scenario to where we complete a master plan, right? We could say, in 10 years, we know that we're going to have this facility that's going to come online. And so maybe we have this very concentrated strategic effort to say, we want to cash fund 20% of that in 10 years, and we're going to build that reserve. And that it's going to allow us to have X amount of cost avoidance by not 100% debt funding it. That could be one strategy. But if you start early enough, then you're allowed to absorb some of that cost avoidance, right? You may not have enough time or the affordability balance of saying we're going to, in 10 years, 100% fund that, right? But it could be a measure to where you have that strategy. That's just one scenario.
And to clarify, this is specifically just a capital reserve account.
That's correct. That is my recommendation.
You connect the dots on how this relates to the policy we have in place around transferring excess fund balance for capital, so for instance, the last few years, we've transferred about 18.5 million for our current policy into capital. So how does, under your recommendations, how does that piece of the puzzle fit in?
Sure. So if we were to have the surplus, unless we modify that fund balance policy, if the unavailable portion were to exceed 20%, that would still result in a transfer to capital reserves, but it's very inconsistent. We can't fund and initiate a capital project without having some sort of dedicated funding source. And that goes whether or not you're cash funding it or debt funding it. You have to have a funding source.
Under that policy, with the if we were to move forward with this set of recommendations, would the transfer occur into the reserve fund, or is that a?
That would be one of the ways. And
Okay.
so the year that we do have leftover money, we could use that surplus versus having to have a budget line. Right? But the plan would be that we would want to make sure that we have a sustainable model that we have set aside. So that eventually, to Melissa's point, it might be a 5-year conversation that you put in a small amount, you start small and you grow to get to whatever project it is or what level you want in that reserve. I know today we have big needs, so we couldn't fund it from a reserve process today, but we need to start at some point to get to that level. And the year that we do have surplus, the reasons we had surplus in the past was truly CARES money and COVID money that came in. So we had opportunities to do that. We were able to then use that money for capital planning that year.
That's the question, but the money that has been was transferred in 22 and 23, is that all gone? Yes.
That was used to fund projects. right
Yes,
out
we
the-
used it to fund projects. Also in the vehicle discussion where you saw the $4 million in 22, much of that was additional, using those funds. So while we did have the $15.4 million transfer the first year of the policy, you saw just about $1.6 million this past year. I'm going to have a little spoiler for next week's meeting, but we're not going to have a transfer this year.
Ball it already. She had it on her slides, so.
Let me ask a question. By having the reserve policy, will that allow us to protect or help protect our AAA bond rating that allows us to borrow money at the cheapest rate?
It will, because as you continue to issue more debt, your investors are going to expect you to have larger reserves, fund
That's what I
balance
thought,
reserves
yeah.
anyway. It needs to offset it to reduce that risk of potential default, which is how they look at it.
I heard Terry mention to go back and take a look at best practices
we
and a
need,
policy,
yeah.
so is that the?
Yeah, we need.
Melissa, I appreciate you looking at a new and strategic way for us to fund our projects.
Right.
You know, the only other just sort of high level comment I would make on it would be, you know, there's capital investments and then there's operating costs, right? But in some cases, making the capital investments can actually lower your operating costs, right? Because you're investing in new technology that's much cheaper to operate than existing clunky technology. So there's oftentimes very good financial rationale to invest more aggressively in better technology rather than keeping the existing stuff that's expensive to operate around. Oftentimes also these coincide with like our environmental goals as well. So I just one thing I would, you know, and I've said this probably in every budget cycle, right? It's like if we need to finance things that are in the public's interest to get done, then I just don't want us to hold back on doing that. Like we do have this capacity, we need to do more, but we do have this great track record behind us too, right? So if there's things that are executable now, I just, you know, I think that's why we're all here. So just, all right.
And we have been using that philosophy, but as you look beyond 1 or 2 year budget and you're looking into that future, there's a lot coming.
Mhm.
So the reason we wanted to start with capital and said, there's a lot coming, but here's a strategy if you're interested for us to start thinking about that going forward. So that's why we married a reserve with the capital outlook today.
All right, great presentation. Any other questions for now?
I guess just one flag that sort of is, it's just capital themed is that, is whether we kind of have a parking lot for requests that are coming to us from partners, whether it's McCormick or, other projects. I know there's a pipeline of those as well, where we're being asked to come to the table to contribute to support capital projects, facilities maintained by other entities. So I just wonder if that's baked into this at all.
It is not baked in today's conversation.
Okay.
We are really focusing on all the needs that we know that are county owned at
Right.
this point. But as in the past, when they come forward, we will bring those to the board for further discussion and resolution.
I think I just love us to be as proactive on our side of the house as we can about that in terms of if, you know, if we are gonna consider funding allocations, which is fine for us to do, but just make from the start of this process, or as we're moving forward in this process, have a lane in place. These are projects that we know we're getting requests around.
And if you have a list of those would be great for us to have, because we really don't have that list. We only have, I'll call it out, we only have heard of one that's ongoing right now in our community, which is Thomas Wolf.
Yeah,
haven't had
that's
a
the
re-
one that comes up.
Okay.
Yes, not over, but,
Okay.
since we know that's there, it's like.
Though we aren't capable of taking on debt for,
What's that?
we're not capable of taking on debt for projects that
Correct.
do not belong to us.
Right,
It would not be debt funding. It would just like we did with McCormick, it would be a cash allocation that the board wants to
Right.
make towards that. And we have time, we have actually 30 minutes ahead of schedule this morning. So if you want to talk about anything, if there's anything missing from the list you had this morning on capital, let's talk about those. My question for you is you had our 5-year list. This is what came up from the departments. If there's something that we are missing, Thomas Wolf could be one that we could talk about more. But I would like to get your input on any projects that are missing from that list that's in your packet this morning. There's things that you're aware of that is missing. We would love to have that.
Yes, in your packet, you do have the 5-year CIP with the specific projects
Right.
as it currently stands. As you heard from Jay earlier, we have just received departmental requests for capital for the next 5 years. And so our capital review team, which is a team made up of about 10 in-house directors, including the 2 assistant county managers and our subject matter experts such as general services and recreation services, all sit on that team and go through these requests. And then we do have criteria scoring that we go through for each project as we look at them. And that team will make recommendations and slot projects on the CIP. And that goes to Avril for her to provide feedback and recommendations to you. So we have not yet started the process. We will next week, beginning next week, of going through these new requests.
So if there are any capital projects that you have that you're aware of, let us know. And there's one slide that we went kind of glossed over, that if we can go back to the fleet budget impact slide. One thing that we're working on is so that doesn't work, huh? One thing that we're working on, commissioners, would be that draft replacement cycle. Anybody want to speak to that? Jackie, you want to speak to this at all? The draft replacement cycle, the number of years that we're looking at when we replace equipment.
Yeah, I mean, the draft was pretty conservative.
I'm speaking, sorry.
Yeah, these are this is on the conservative side of like the industry standards for replacement cycles for these types of vehicles.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm understanding the numbers on this chart. So is this all like when we're buying vehicles, paying cash for them or financing, or just could you help break that out?
So in 22 and 23, we did cash finance. We did pay-go for all our vehicles. In 24, to balance this budget, we are financing the 24 vehicles. This is the 24 adopted, you see, is as we adopted it. I brought a carry forward amendment to you a couple months ago because 2.5 million of the 4 million from last year is still vehicles we've not received or taken or gotten to order yet. So we're actually close to $5 million in the budget now from all of these vehicle orders that are falling behind or we're unable to procure.
Okay, so for like that $2.3 million number in FY24, that's not the total value of all the vehicles we purchased. That would actually be a bigger number, but that's the number that's actually costing us in that budget because we are financing part of it.
We're financing all
All
of
of
that.
it, yeah.
So that's balanced out on the revenue side with bond
Okay.
proceeds.
But in 22 and 23, that's actually the cost of the vehicles, and we wrote a check and paid for them.
That's where we finished. However, like I said, the $4 million, we didn't spend the $4 million
We weren't able to
last
spend it
year.
all. We planned to.
So
but we're not
$2.5 million came forward this year.
What we're financing, we're doing that through banks and not bonds, right?
Yes,
Right, because it's cheaper.
yes. And again, when we talk about, to Commissioner Wells' point about what we're debt financing or pay going, we don't want to debt finance assets that are not going to be around for a while.
Jackie, back to the replacement cycle. Is this the recommendation that y'all are coming to with this number of years for each of these categories, or can you speak more to that?
I think that we would need to have more conversations across departments before we came up with like a solid recommendation. And again, this is just to replace the current vehicles that we have. This would not be to grow the fleet, that 5.75 million. And it wouldn't, like, there's no escalation for what it would cost, a couple years from now.
So to Commissioner's point, we do need more details because it might be a 10-year replacement, but if it has high mileage or a lot of maintenance costs, we will look to do it at a different schedule. But I wanted to bring this up because this draft replacement scheduled at 10 years for a regular government vehicle, 6 years for an ambulance, and 4 years with patrol, 7 years maybe for SRO vehicle. That's about a $5 million cost just to maintain that at 10 years. Jackie calls it conservative schedule. 10 years, 6 years, and 4 to 7 years.
Mhm.
That annual cost is about 5.7 million in vehicle costs. On top of your annual capital that we just talked about.
Just to maintain.
Yes. sir.
And when you say 5.75 million, again, would that be assuming that we're paying all cash to buy the vehicles or all debt or a split?
We would budget that as an expenditure.
Mhm.
So if we did go out to debt for some of that, then we would budget that on the revenue side. There's and balance it on the revenue side.
I
But
think
that-
what, I
with
think
the
what Bernie was
expenditure
asking,
would
John,
be-
would be, that's the expenditure, but if it's debt, it'll be some interest on top of it. So this is the
Yes.
cash price right now. This is the cash price to do those vehicles.
To buy
right
the
now.
vehicles.
Yes.
I thought what you were gonna ask me is if this is the price to do the electric vehicles versus old fashioned gas. And I think that's what we're working towards, is the whole sustainable fleet model, so
Yeah.
they're a little bit elevated.
Well, I didn't even think that needed to be asked, but this is so obvious, so. That this will, I mean, it is what our policy is, right? Is that we're gonna buy the cleanest vehicles we can that meet the role the vehicle needs to do. But, anyway, I mean, I think it will put more pressure on us to do some more debt on that, because there's typically it's gonna be another, it's gonna be a little bit more expensive upfront, and it's gonna be cheaper to operate. The life cycle costs might be even lower in the long run to replace a lot of these vehicles with electric. So over a 10-year period, that number might be a lower number because of our good policy, but it will, the upfront price tag is gonna be a little bit more, so. But the 5.75 is like the average number you think we need to be thinking about over the coming years.
Again, that's just to replace the existing vehicles. So if, say, we add 2 stormwater technicians next
Mhm.
year who need new trucks, that's an addition to the fleet. So this number doesn't think about if we add staff for which additional vehicles are needed, or if we adopt a motor pool where we decide that there may be additional vehicles we add to the fleet for sharing across the organization. That number doesn't include those costs. Jackie co-chairs our vehicle evaluation team, which is a multidisciplinary group across departments. And they're working to, I'm not gonna say they've solved all the world's problems, but they are working hard on coming up with strategies around a lot of these issues, as well as looking at the replacement cycle and the requests that come in annually to vet what we might need to purchase in the future.
Okay, so, I mean, there's no major, I mean, there's no, I mean, maybe we do add some stormwater or something like that, but there's not any like big picture things that are expected to like radically change the number of like the size of the
We
fleet,
got
right?
48 requests for new vehicles this year.
That are not replacements.
Additional.
Additional,
vehicles.
it was 111 vehicle requests, 48 of those were to expand our fleet.
And is part of that to address the motor pool
Yes.
aspect? Because this
think
is like new
19
information for me. I didn't actually realize we pay a lot of our employees over 50 cents a mile to drive their own vehicles, which is probably like the most expensive way to meet that need, right? So again, maybe we need to spend some more money on buying vehicles, but it's going to save us a lot more money elsewhere in the budget, right?
Yeah, strategy and innovation has really looked into that. I think reimbursement rates for just HHS last year was $366,000 in
Yeah.
fuel reimbursement costs for
But-
1 year. for one
But that also includes over 100 different drivers. So we don't yet have the resources to purchase.
Alleviating some of that need.
Then why couldn't we buy those vehicles? And why do you say we can't? Why can't we? Because it sounds like the way we're doing it right now is probably the most expensive way you could do it, right?
So we have 100 or so drivers in just one department, and then
In social work, there's probably over 100 folks who are driving on a daily basis all around the county. And sometimes outside the county. But the other piece that you see when I bring forward $2.5 million, we're purchasing about 40 to 50 cars, trying to purchase 40 to 50 cars a year, and we can't get them. Right. So even if we did increase the budget to purchase 100 vehicles in a given year, they're just not out there for us to get.
But our goal will be to get there.
But that's sort of a short-term issue, right? Like, I mean, that's like the moment we're in, but that's not, if we said, hey, like, as a general matter, be a lot more cheap, it'd be a lot more affordable for the taxpayers to like have those vehicles, and we can probably do a lot of like really eco vehicles to do it too, right? To help. So if we made that the goal, like we could, over a year or two, we could probably move towards making that
Right,
happen,
and that,
right?
and that is what Jackie and her team is working on, to bring that recommendation forward, and then we will have a strategy of how we can get there, given our environment, how we can get there over time.
Great.
So we have a lot of small, we call them foundational infrastructure that we need to build for our organization. So we're working on building, but not to the point where it would just devastate our budget in 1 year, but build towards that in a couple of years.
There are there are considerations as well as where do you put these vehicles? Because it's not convenient for everyone to come into downtown Asheville to get a vehicle before they go back out around. So there's a lot of factors at play in making this work.
Certainly, some total size of fleet today.
560.
Yeah, that are operational, maybe fewer are active, but yeah.
You said that there was one department.
Health and Human Services has over 100 social workers. They do have a pool of about 10 to 12 vehicles assigned to them. And so someone may drive 3 days a week, be in our office 2 days a week. It varies, especially with our Child Protective Services investigators. They're going out when it's needed, and they may not know when that is.
And then we'll need the software infrastructure to make sure we can schedule those vehicles in and out. So there's some foundation issues that we need to solve.
This is good long-term thinking, though. I appreciate it's a good conversation.
Absolutely. So anything else on this that you wanted to note, Avril?
Nope, this is, I want you to be aware of that.
All right.
I'll say just before I mean, we can move past the vehicle and fleet, but I would like to ask you all to just reflect on what we've heard so far today around capital, around the fleet and electrification projects, and around reserves, and like what's ruminating in your mind. I mean, we've had some good discussion, but I don't want to go for a break without hearing any other lingering thoughts that you might have, or maybe some potential next steps.
The one other is that, and we're going to talk about this more in our committee, but the Affordable Housing Committee is, we're looking at we just passed these bonds, but we're coming out of the gates pretty fast on this. Like, we've already deployed, the funds haven't been deployed, but we've committed to projects that totals like $13 or $14 million. So, and we're seeing this great pipeline of projects, developing, and there's sort of the response we were hoping for is happening in terms of a lot of developers stepping up and saying, hey, we can scale this kind of work up, right? Because we weren't sure we were actually going to be able to deploy all those funds, right? So that's great. But we had a brief conversation at our last meeting, looking at our we set these 2030 goals, and the bonds, of course, are absolutely essential towards getting on the right trajectory to get there. But they won't get there we won't get there with just those funds, right? So we'll get a long way there. But as we start looking at the out years of 2028, 29, 30, we will probably have deployed all of these initial affordable housing bond funds around that time. So, and of course, we've got our county-owned properties and those projects. So just to say that we're going to need to think about sometime between now and 2030 having some other revenue strategy to continue the level of new production that we're now successfully seeing, but which, if we want to sustain it, it'll need some additional kind of capital injection, maybe in 2026 or 27, somewhere around then. And so that could be another, could be that we go to the voters and say, hey, voters, look how successful this was. Would you like to keep this going? Maybe for some of the county-owned properties, I mean, there might be some other financing strategies that are unique to county-owned land. There's been some informal discussions around that, but I don't think we've really talked about it in a more formal setting. So I just would also note those, because that is, and what we're seeing is great, but I mean, as we're getting further into it, we're realizing like, if we want to sustain this, it will be a major ongoing capital commitment into the years ahead. It's not something we need to do this year or next year, but like maybe a year or two after that, we will need to plan for it.
And I think as you saw Jay's slide about our future considerations, one thing we've asked, we've reached out to departments, including Matt Cable's team, and we want to incorporate projects into the CIP so that we're looking at these from the grand scale, so that we understand what's in front of us and that the CIP is a roadmap for the entire organization.
That's great. That's really smart.
All right, other thoughts, questions? Oh, well, maybe could we just stay on that for a second if we do have a little bit of extra time? Jasmine, I think that was a great observation you shared. So yeah, I mean, there's that project, but it's a big one potentially, right? So should we spend a few minutes talking about that? Because Avril, has the county received a formal request related to that project? I mean, obviously it's in the newspaper all the time and there's plenty of discussion around it.
No, we
but-
have not today
Yeah.
received a formal request. But we know that as a partner in our community, one of those community assets, similar to McCormick, there would be a request, but we haven't heard anything at this point.
Okay, and I know there's some informal meetings going on around kind of exploring the different scenarios, right? So but I guess, does anyone have a sense for when a request might come to us, right? Because I think we would have to fit it in, like, and rightly kind of compare that alongside all the other projects that we're
Correct.
having to think about too, right? So,
I don't have a timeline.
do you have any, Terry?
I've not heard of a timeline.
And if we did make a contribution to it, we can't borrow from it because we don't own it. So legally, that's not an
Correct.
option.
Correct.
So it would be some sort of like,
Cash contribution.
we can commit to this amount per year over some period of time
Correct.
if we were going to participate.
You know, I've often wondered if they're coming to us with a big request, when do we get involved?
So they have actually asked, I mean, the Arts Council had actually asked if we would sit on their planning committee, I guess is the right word to phrase that, Commissioner. Would that be the right way to phrase their planning committee around Thomas Wolf?
I think there are informal conversations going on.
Okay. So they're informal conversations at this point, nothing formal yet. So when it does become formal, I guess we have the ability then to be a part of that conversation.
Yeah, because the reason I asked that, you know, we have a lot of expertise on our staff. And I think it would help, even though you might be against it, but I think it would help if we were in, you know, if you're coming to us for a big request,
Right.
we need to have input at least.
As we sit today, I will tell you that staff, they're already telling me, don't add any more to their plate, especially if it's just gonna be to meetings and discussing and stuff. We have a lot going on, as you can tell, so.
And do, so, go ahead, Parker.
I was just gonna say, to state the obvious, that I'm glad that I'm seeing this slide deck and having this presentation today in the context of that future request. I wish I had it in my head during the McCormick conversations.
So Terry, I know you've been tracking this. I mean, is there a range for what? Because I've just read what I've seen in the newspaper around this, right? That there's, you know, and that maybe there's, what I read, I think there were 4 scenarios. And maybe 2 of those have been taken off the table. So there's, I don't know, is there anything you could share with us about what the big picture around this sounds like?
I think what I've seen is right around 100 million total project, but I don't think they've made decisions on specifically which one they're going with at this time. I think they're just exploring those different ones. But it did sound like the city council voted, right? The city council voted for 2 of the projects. And I think both of those were somewhere in that 100 million range. I think they took off, if I'm remembering correctly, when the city discussed it, they took off the Broadway, which would have been the highest cost one. And then they took off the lower cost one, and I think they left the two that were right there in the middle around 100 million. And I think that's where they directed staff to start looking at those.
Well, it sounds like if there's an appetite from commission to eventually explore that, or we know it's going to end up on our desk anyway, it would seem prudent to open some line of communication. If it's informal right now, fair enough. But if we can open up some ideas so we don't get hit with this really large request 3 months from now, if we already see it coming, I would share Commissioner Whiteside's concern that don't want to add any more to our staff's plate, but at least have some clarity on what is coming down the pike for us, and to the extent that we can prime ourselves for what that ask will look like.
So I think I have a little differing opinion on this. I think we need to have a conversation about how we continue to engage in the funding needs of the city versus our own needs. I mean, we're looking at a significant amount of financial needs coming toward us for capital. And where do we draw the line in ensuring that we're funding our own internal projects that support the entire county of Buncombe versus individual projects that the city should have been funding all along as well? So I think we have a bigger conversation to have before determining whether we want to be at the table or not on this. And I hear what you're saying too, Parker, on McCormick, and I know I've supported that, but I think now that we've seen this, it gives me pause to think about how we support projects that are not directly our own.
Well, I think this is the kind of space to do it, right? So, because we are, I mean, you get these projects come and it's like, oh gosh, how could we not be part of this? But then you have to look at like, well, in the context of all these other responsibilities that we definitely have to lead on,
And that's
what can we do, or can we be part of it? So I think this is a great context to kind of get some commission, even if there hasn't been a formal request to us. I mean, we know this issue's out there and it's a tough one for this city because it is this very big ticket kind of, and the operating costs are also very tough, right? So if there is some guidance we want to give to the commission, I mean, to Asheville around our collective thinking on this, I mean, I would encourage folks to share your, and obviously we can all learn more. I mean, you can reserve the right to change your mind as we learn more, but like, what is our starting point for this at this time? I mean, I appreciate your thoughts on that. The other folks want to.
It's not an important project,
Yeah.
but where does that fall in line in terms of priority for our other projects? And I do appreciate reserving the right to change my mind. But as of today, where we're sitting looking at this and these numbers, I question whether or not we do get involved in those conversations of supporting.
Yeah, I'm generally against it at the moment with the information I have today. I also don't want to sign our staff up to go to like longstanding committee meetings that may not have an end. But there is a table at which there's an empty chair. I'm okay with sitting at it, listening to it.
So can I weigh in real quick? When I said staff,
Yeah.
if staff is going to be a participant, I would need to make sure we're representing the board's opinions, right?
Right.
So I wouldn't want staff to just go and sit, but I want to know where you land, so we know
Yeah.
what we can say and what we can participate. So this conversation is helpful for us going forward if we know where you guys land.
And I think, like, as I look at this list, I see a number of items that are either direct collaborations with the city, for instance, the Liberator Shelter, or directly aligned with top priorities that the city holds, for instance, affordable housing. And so, to me, like the way my mind goes is stepping back and saying, like, actually, there is this cluster of projects where there is either a direct collaborative approach that's ongoing, and or we are working hard on a shared policy priority. And here's what the county's bringing to the table in terms of resources on. So versus it feels like right now, it's sort of like everything is sort of a bit siloed and so I would be interested in sort of stepping back from this and saying, okay, which of these actually is there already sort of a high degree of alignment or collaboration around, and then how would a project like, McCormick or Thomas will
fall on that list. You know, I mean, I think we're facing hard choices around our own internal priorities before we can get to other ones as sort of a starting point. But I don't want to miss us saying out loud, and in the spirit of good partnership, us saying out loud, like, look at these ways that we are investing or have, you know, allocated significant resources towards shared projects or shared priorities. So that's kind of how my general orientation to this set of issues. And I'm not aware of any others in the pipeline, but I guess that's a question I would like to know is, are there other projects that, you know, where there are kind of delayed infrastructure or needs that, whether it's from Asheville or another local jurisdiction, or, you know, that are gonna be coming to us. Just so that we at least have that awareness on the radar.
I'm not aware of any other significant ones. So if there are, I don't think they've been brought to our attention. Some of the Greenway projects are like collaborations with some of the municipalities. I think on some of the Greenway projects maybe, but those are going to be funded through the bond funds and Greenway funds.
Commissioner, just got a note, Project Aspire is one that has come to us. It's not a city or county project, but it's the YMCA.
The YMCA project.
And then the Pit of Despair could be another possible. I hate to say this because it's a terrible
Oh, the
name.
spot across from the
There you go.
Harris Cherokee. That piece of land.
Bit of despair.
It's a terrible name.
Okay, I think
That, is there a request from?
No, but you're asking what's out there.
what's out there. Yeah.
We haven't had a request.
Flags.
It's looking better. Maybe I don't know. So, okay, well, any other commissioners want to chime in at this point? No. We're not making some decision, but just to. I guess I would, you know, I my 2 cents on it would be, although it's not, it's, you know, it is a city-owned facility. I do think it's a project where, like McCormick, it's owned by the city, but it's certainly a regional facility, right? It is not, I mean, I would assume the data would show that the majority of the people who utilize the facility are actually from outside the city, right? So it's something that benefits certainly the county, certainly Western North Carolina. So although we don't have title to it, I certainly feel like it's a project where it is frankly unfair for the taxpayers in Asheville by themselves to have to think about paying for all this, right? Because it's the benefits extend regionally. So from that spirit, I'm like really open to the idea that the county would be a partner in it. However, I just don't, I mean, my general starting point, part of what I heard was that they took the idea of the lower cost option off the table, right? Which would be sort of looking at the idea of, because this is definitely one, and hey, I served on city council in the past, so I've owned part of this. But you know, it's definitely been a facility that has not been taken care of, to state the obvious, right? It's a facility that should have had a much more robust annual maintenance facility so that it didn't fall into kind of disrepair that it is today. So, but that's, you know, that's water under the bridge. But to me, looking at all of these other priorities that we face and that the city faces too, around a lot of these issues, part of my concern is that they're not going to study an option around not the future of the facility as some significantly enhanced facility above and beyond what it's traditionally been, but basically just what if we sort of kept the level of service that we associate with this facility, but actually take care of this building? And initially that will probably require pretty significant investment just to kind of get it going again. But then the idea of, and then we really take care of it in the future, because I think the scenarios that are left are all ones that like envision kind of a significant redo of it to make it something that would be a lot nicer than what's been in the past, but which also carries a very significant price tag. So I'll just share that. That's my biggest concern, is that we're not actually, so I'm worried this process will go forward and then they'll come in and say it's $100 million project. And unless the county puts in $30 million or some very big number, then the project can't happen. And yet, like, a lower cost option never got really studied in a serious way. So that's my biggest sort of process concern, is that if we say we're open to it, but then there's only, I don't know, that there's not a more affordable option that's seriously considered. If they were going to do that, then I would probably say I'm open to the county playing some role in that, because I don't think it's fair for the city to shoulder that by itself. But if they're not going to study that, then I would be reticent to indicate an openness to being a partner in the project. So, any other thoughts on this one for today? All right. Are we, what's next? We're taking a break? Is this the lunch break? Okay, is it here? All right, all right. And when do you want us to start again?
Ongoing revenue producing opportunities for the city,
Thank you.
which I don't see them sharing later down the road. Whereas on the flip side, when we talk about the volume of folks in our jail and our courthouse who APD brings in, they're not really contributing to our maintenance of those facilities.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. You're not wrong.
Again, so thanks for whoever pulled all the food together. It was yummy. So what's next, Avril?
So we're
We're
gonna
talking-
have a discussion on recurring
Recurring expenses,
expenditures
thank
and
you.
revenues next.
Right.
So now that we've discussed our major assets, one-time expenses, and started a conversation on reserves, we're going to talk about the largest part of our budget, and that's recurring expenditures and revenues. So what are recurring expenditures? Mainly, this is the cost of doing business, staffing, having the necessities in order to conduct the business of the county. This includes all of our regular operating, such as utilities, training of staff, contracted services, equipment, and ongoing maintenance and repair. Inflation cannot be understated, and while slowing has created new price points for most of these essentials. Additionally, we provide direct assistance to Health and Human Services clients and around $2.6 million in grants to the community through strategic partnerships, aging services, and recreation. This category also includes our community commitments, the transfers we make to other funds to support the strategic aims of the county to include transportation, affordable housing, early childhood, conservation easements, and reparations. Another large recurring expenditure is education, to include the local current expense to K-12 schools, support of AB Tech and other education support, and finally, our annual debt payments. All told, these expenditures make up about 94% of our general fund budget. This graph depicts the trends of services across the organization to show that there has been greater demand for our services over the last 5 years. In these examples, we see planning have an uptick in stormwater cases, while Health and Human Services sees increases over time for food and nutrition services and entries into foster care. Emergency medical services responses have a sharp rise in service demand, and the number of property assessments requiring completion has surged. All this to say, county services continue to be in demand and require more resources to sustain the supply to meet that level of demand. When we look at operating costs across functions, we see some stark increases in general government and public safety. General government increases largely stem from additional funding needed for information technology support and solutions, as well as maintenance and repair of county facilities, largely due to deferred maintenance. With larger investment in public safety over the last 5 years, this is resulting costs for launching the community paramedicine program, additional equipment, more training, uniforms for staff, as well as meeting the rising costs of contracted services such as jail health. Education is also a recurring expense. Over the last 5 years, our contribution to education has increased $37.7 million. Of note, the increase in funding of $26.8 million over the last 2 years is a 28% increase. And that cannot be sustained without substantial increases to revenues or cuts to other areas. As a service provider, the majority of our cost relates to staffing. In fiscal year 2019, our county workforce was 1,472 regular positions across the organization. At that time, many departments expressed that they were understaffed for the level of service that they were expected to provide. Flash forward 5 years, and we've increased our workforce by 21% to ensure we are providing that service. We've made a heavy investment in public safety led by bolstering our emergency services function, consolidating public safety 911 communications, and growing our justice services. In general government, we have consolidated some functions to county administration to engage the community in our efforts, growing our human resources to better cater to the diverse needs of our workforce, and information technology to support the organization in IT support and service delivery. Libraries have seen a large increase in staffing as we ensure that we can fully staff all existing library locations. So to recap our recurring expenditures by function in fiscal year 24, This includes salary and operating expenses, with human services at $95.7 million, followed by public safety at $89 million, general government at $66.3 million. Cultural and recreational function is $10.9 million, and economic and physical development at $8.1 million, while transfers to our community commitments come in at $9.1 million. Total, this is $279.1 million, 66% of the general fund. I'll return to this in a few minutes, but now I'd like to talk about our revenues. So we transfer to multi-year funds our transportation dollars to augment transportation budget annually, conservation easements, our early childhood, affordable housing. Those are the transfers for our community commitments ongoing. So they come out of the general fund via cash to the multi-year fund. So we have four major sources of revenue totaling 94% of our general fund revenue. These are ad valorem property tax, our local option sales tax, intergovernmental revenue, and sales and service. You also see a silver slice of pie that contains a variety of small revenue sources that include interfund transfer revenue, such as $5 million for AV Tech, other taxes and licenses, such as the Register of Deeds excise tax, half of which we remit back to the state. Permits and fees. Building permit fee revenue is restricted to fund the expenses to deliver that service. Investment earnings and other revenue. Much of this revenue is either restricted in purpose or may come unexpectedly. Our largest source of revenue, and the one that we have the most control over, is the green slice, ad val property taxes. Over the last 5 years, property tax revenue has averaged about 62 to 65% of our budget revenue. There have been tax rate changes in fiscal year 22, 2 pennies over revenue neutral, and fiscal year 24, 1 penny for education. And we can generally count on 3% natural growth in a non-revaluation year with no change of the tax rate. That estimate would yield around $7.6 million additional revenue in fiscal year 25. A penny on the tax rate creates a little over $5 million in additional revenue, and this is the tool at our greatest disposal for increasing revenues to the general fund. The blue slice of revenue is our local option sales tax. This is made up around 10 to 12% of budgeted revenue over the last 5 years. Sales tax has been a decidedly volatile revenue source, seeing less than 0.5% increase from FY19 to fiscal year 20, followed by 2 years of 14% increases. Last year, we saw only a 5.5% increase, and while reporting is 3 months behind from the state, early returns on sales tax revenue this year actually show it flat to last year, less than the 10% growth we budgeted this year in fiscal year 23. Prior to the large increases that you see over fiscal year 21 and 22, sales tax revenue for Buncombe County had averaged less than a 5% increase year over year since 2011. Intergovernmental revenue has made up 12 to 14% of our general fund revenue and is largely restricted to specific purposes, with around 87% of this revenue related to health and human services mandated services. Most of the remainders relate to state agreements or shared services with municipalities or other governments. Here you see year over year intergovernmental revenue, and that when we remove one-time COVID-related revenues, the amount of restricted revenue has actually decreased 2% from fiscal year 19 to fiscal year 23. We did see some unrestricted intergovernmental revenue recently in what the state calls Medicaid hold harmless payments. About 20 years ago, the state held back sales tax from counties in order to pay the county's share of Medicaid claims. Fiscal year 21 was the first year these sales tax receipts eclipsed the cost of Medicaid, and we received a payback from the state. While that payment has increased each year and we budgeted $3 million for it this year, it is tied to sales tax receipts and we may not be able to rely on it long term. Our last major revenue source is the purple slice, sales and service, making up 5 to 6% of revenue. This revenue is based on sales, with ambulance receipts being the largest driver of this revenue source, increasing from $6 to $10 million over the 5-year period. Some revenues, such as property leases, have dropped off, while others are subject to demand, such as public health services. Also included are collection fees charged to municipalities and the TDA for property tax collections. Are there any questions about revenues? We budgeted $48.9 million this year. And right now we're flat to the FY23 actual. Any other questions about revenues? So returning to our recurring expenditures by function, I want to remind you that this represents $279.1 million in expenditures in fiscal year 2024. Here we add $121.9 million for education. And with $19.9 million in debt payments, this comes to $420.9 million, 96.5% of our fiscal year 24 general fund budget. Our 4 major revenue sources are budgeted at $379.8 million. Ideally, we would cover all recurring expenditures with budgeted revenue. The remainder of the expenditure budget is used for one-time expenditures. In fiscal year 24, this includes vehicles, pay-go, capital outlay, grant matches, and incentives. But I want us to remember that our recurring expenditures are growing at a larger rate than our revenues, and that the demand continues to increase for services across the county.
So we just threw away through a lot of trend data at you folks. And so I'd like to hear from each of you, which of those trends stood out most to you?
In a quick refresher on the other, outside of property taxes, the other smaller revenue sources. Memory serves, we have no authority over changing them, but I just wanted to.
You're talking about the little silver stacks.
Yeah, there's like rental car taxes and.
Yes, there's
couple
rental
other-
car tax receipts in there. There's heavy equipment rental. We are currently levying the highest amount allowed by the state on those items.
All of those. Okay.
So the rental car receipts, I think, came into about $1 million this past year.
Mhm.
Heavy equipment rental came to somewhere around $500,000.
Mhm.
And this varies from year to year. It also included here is investment earnings. And one of the reasons that we didn't dip into fund balance this year is that our investment earnings brought in $6 million due to the high interest rates. We budgeted $500,000, but that doesn't allow me, and our finance officer would slap my hand if I tried to budget $6 million in investment earnings next year to balance the budget. So in 3 years ago, we actually lost money in investment earnings. So that's not, so as I say, like a lot of that silver slice, our permits and fees revenue, our building permits brought in almost $4 million of revenue, but per state statute, all that $4 million must be spent on doing the service of providing building permits. So that's a restricted revenue that we can't really work with. There is the Register of Deeds excise tax, which is a tax on sales, real estate sales, and half of that must be remitted back to the state. So these sources are generally either not that reliable or they're restricted revenues.
Including the sales tax, I guess, too. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
The sales tax is not restricted.
It's restricted in the sense that like, we don't have the authority to like change how it's levied or who it's levied on. Those types of.
Yes, we're
The revenue's
receiving
unrestricted,
the,
but how it's done is restricted, yeah, right.
yes, it's unrestricted revenue in that we can spend the sales tax dollars in any public way, but for any public function, but we are bringing down as much sales tax as allowed to us by state statute.
So then, which, if any of these trends just stood out to somebody, you know, as something notable? There are a lot of them.
I mean, I think overall, at the end of the day, the trend is that our expenses are growing faster than our revenues. So all things considered, while we could look individually, I think the bigger picture is we've got some difficult decisions ahead of us to make.
Were there any other surprises for anybody else in there?
I know you mentioned typically about 3% growth is where we are around the property tax, just in a general year. And you may have shown this earlier and I just don't remember, what is our growth of our expenses? Do you have a sense of kind of the percentage?
Over
growth?
this time period, our expenditures have increased 6 to 7% annually.
6 to 7% annually?
Mhm.
Thank you. And then with the sales tax, you're saying we're basically flat right now. So are you expecting us to come in for this budget year about 4 million short?
If that trend continues, yes, we would be $4 million. We would receive $4 million less revenue than we have budgeted.
Okay.
But as I say, that's 3 months in arrears. We've seen 3 months of data for the year so far.
So that's not great, but then I'm glad you mentioned like the interest, like the self-generated funding from our investments are gonna generate how much more?
Well, we don't know this year, but as we finish fiscal year 23 and the general fund's investment earnings totaled $6.5 million.
That would actually more than offset the sales tax loss.
It did,
Based on forecast.
yes, and we actually came in under budget last year on sales tax. So those investment earnings were really the reason we didn't appropriate fund balance
Yep.
in fiscal year 23.
I mean, so high interest rates are bad for a lot of different reasons, like especially like affordable housing, everything you want to build. But as a government entity that has to sit on a lot of money just to have it there to do all the functions all the time, it's actually quite beneficial.
Yes, I'm not sure of the math of how it works out both ways, but in this particular case, it was helpful to us.
Any other thoughts on this topic or questions?
I do want to go back, John, just to make sure that I heard you correctly. That over the last 2 years, we have increased our expenditures for public education, $26 million.
That's
Did I hear that
correct.
correctly?
That's correct, from
So
95
28%.
to 120.
And how much is that over what our stated revenue growth is for public education? How much have we been spent over? And if you don't know that offhand, that's okay.
When we increased the penny, we gave that to education from 23 to 24, that is a 16% increase, 1 year increase. So our, like I said, our revenues are not matching that.
Right.
And our revenues aren't matching the 6-7% of our recurring expenditures that we're seeing. So that's not a level we can sustain without either increasing revenues or making some cuts somewhere.
Right.
Mhm.
I think this is like the most challenging part of all that we do, right? Because it's such a big part of the budget. And it's so challenging for how you're gonna plan for it going forward, right? Because it's like, we make the decision, but it's not just like a county department where it's everybody's in the same organization. It's this others, it's a separate organization, two separate organizations that come to us late in our process and propose stuff. You know, we've had policies in the past around, we're gonna do funding based on our revenue growth and y'all will benefit from that. But we've hardly ever stuck to that. We've obviously funded it mostly at much greater levels. So, you know, I would love it if there's some way that we could come up with more of a true multi-year plan around what we're going to do in terms of funding for public education, but which had their buy-in. I mean, and not, I don't mean this to sound critical, but I don't think the schools were ever bought in to this other idea, right? And so anyway, I think that would be so much better for everyone if we had that instead of this annual big, you know, kind of decision that just gets made on a yearly basis, in which nobody, even with the big increases, nobody seems to come out of it happy or satisfied. You know, everyone's like, I didn't get what I think I should have gotten. So we need more of a shared plan for how to do this going forward. But I've expressed this to some of the school officials, and they've said, you know, we kind of agree with that in concept, but we are also have a lot on our plate right now. There's a merger analysis going on. They're doing some internal studies around what they think their funding needs are. So I don't know that right now is the time that's realistic for that to happen. But I think in the long run, it's one of the most important things we could do to get a better budget planning process in place for everyone around this. So maybe this isn't the year to do it, but it needs to happen at some point. Other thoughts, questions?
Just for clarity's sake, what I'd ask, is that something you would like to staff to take back and think about?
Think about. We actually had some meetings with some of the school officials to see if they would like to engage in this. And basically, and again, I don't mean this to sound critical because they do have other things they're doing simultaneously that are important. But their basic response is they don't think they have the kind of capacity to do it right now, or it's not the right time to do it for some other reason. So I don't think there's anything to do on this right now. It's more of just, you know, maybe next year, you know, but I'm just going to say it out loud to sort of food for thought.
Right. And to Brownie's point, we have shared this with the schools that we want more of a long-term plan. And the things they're doing now, I think would help us to feed into that long-term plan. Like in the paper recently, Asheville City Schools is doing that capacity study of their buildings. They're also doing a strategic plan. So I think those parts will help to inform how we do a long-term plan with them. So maybe not to Brownie's point, the 24-25 budget, but definitely we should be ready for the 25-26.
All right, what's next?
So if we don't have anything else regarding our recurring expenditures and revenues, we have a handful of updates for you on community commitments. And these updates include, Rachel Nygaard will share with us an update on the literacy pilot program we have funded. We're in the third year funding the AVL Rise. And then I'll have brief updates on the homeowner grant and septic repair programs.
So we've been talking about the county's general fund budget at the $400 million plus level and the investments in education over $100 million. Now we're zooming way in and talking about a specific program that exists for Buncombe County within our education portfolio. The reason that this is included on your agenda today is that this started as a special initiative driven by commissioner interest. And so we come back to you for some direction on how you want to proceed as we build our budget for FY2025. Quick summary, this is related to a program that was developed in response to a RFP, a request for proposals that we issued as a county for an education pilot program to respond to needs for improvement in literacy outcomes and racial disparities within education. We did award a 3-year contract as part of that RFP that began July 1, 2021 for a period ending this coming next June. And that was to Open Doors of Asheville. So I will tell a little bit about what that project is. In the way of background, the reason that we got into this work is our strategic plan, which was adopted when we think back to the 2025 Buncombe County Strategic Plan. It was developed pre-pandemic. A lot of the community listening and work that we did was before COVID-19, but when we actually adopted the plan, we were a few months, I think, into the pandemic, and our plan kicked off that July of 2020. And so later that fiscal year, we issued this request for proposals. I mentioned that timeframe because COVID, all of the things that went upside down and went sideways, and particularly education was an area, a sector that was really impacted by the pandemic when we think about how education was being delivered in remote learning settings. So that as a backdrop for us, knowing that was the context for the development of this new program. So this RFP was looking for a community-based organization to come forward with ideas of a proven model for out of school time, not what's happening during the public school hours, but out of school time for that educational support using tested methods to try to address those outcomes. So AVL Rise is the program that was developed as a result. This is a peer-to-peer literacy program, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It was based on a model in Washington, D.C. called REACH. And the peer-to-peer component is that we've got high school students who are struggling readers who are paired with elementary school students, and both students receive literacy lessons and instruction, and that tutoring that occurs is from the high school student to the elementary school student with the support of the educators. It's currently in 2 high schools and 2 elementary schools. The initial pairing was Asheville High School and Hall Fletcher. And this year, in the 3rd year, they've added T.C. Robertson High School and Estes Elementary School. Here's a little bit more about how the program works. You all are familiar with this. We've been sharing copies of, say, different reports. I know that this summer we sent the year 2 annual report, and some of you have had a chance to visit the program. The high schoolers received the higher programming dose because they're receiving instruction and being taught as tutors. And then they work with those elementary schools twice per week on their tutoring. And the program also has some of these supplemental pieces that you see listed, enrichment trips, work experiences, etc. The goal is to get to 100 students, 50 tutors and 50 tutees this fiscal year. When I checked in with Open Doors most recently, they're at 40 so far, adding Estes on, and that will get them to their goal. They have plans to be on target to attain that goal of 100 total students this year. There's some information about the students who are served demographically.
And can I ask a question, Rachel?
Certainly.
Can you back one slide?
Yep.
And in terms of ramping up to 100, that sounds great. In terms of the lower number of students, like last year, is that a result of just like coming out of COVID that was impacting it, or not? And so I guess my question is, if there were only 28 last year, why do they feel like they could get to 100, or what prevented it from getting to 100 last year? Is maybe another way of asking that.
Yep,
That's the
last
question.
year there were, the programming was active in Asheville High School and Hall Fletcher only.
Mhm.
And so this year they'll have twice the number of schools that they're active in.
Okay.
And they did express the pace that being able to ramp up the program was not as fast as they had initially hoped. Partially, like one of the factors was being able to access schools. The school systems were slow to bring in outside partners to deliver programming within the school buildings as a result of COVID, from what I understand.
All right, thank you.
They have been working to gather data about the results on the students. So this is on the tutor side. I will start by pointing out that in 23-24, so the third year of the 3-year pilot, they'll have their assessment tool in place, which is called Ames Web. And that will help them have more solid data on the literacy gains. What they have here included so far has been self-reported information from those observers that are working with the students, noticing improvements in reading fluency, growth, and confidence. And they've had 2 of their high schoolers graduate during the time of participating in the program, and they did both graduate on time and enroll in 4-year college. There are not results yet for the 2 Ts for the elementary school students within the program. And using the tool that they're implementing for that this year, which is called Lexia, that information will be available. They report to us quarterly. So what we have in hand today is 1 quarter's worth of information. When we get our 2nd quarter report, it will have the baseline for this year. And then when we get our further final report, we'll be able to see growth for the year. So we will share that information with commissioners as it comes along. One of the things that's tricky that's built in with pilot programs is we have to take some action about whether or not to continue before we get the final closeout reporting. That will come when the 3rd year completes in June. And of course, we're building the budget now for what will end up starting in July. So we will be sharing information with you as it comes our way, and seeking some direction from commissioners about your appetite to continue this program. We will need to bid it. We can't simply continue with this vendor as a result of how we do procurement. So we would need to have some kind of open application process if we do continue the investment. Those are my updates. This is an opportunity that if commissioners have thoughts or guidance at this time, we're open to hearing it. And we know that this will be an open conversation as we continue.
All right, Rachel, hey, thanks for the update. Have been looking forward to this. So I guess my initial reaction is that it's good the data is coming in, but it's not a lot of data yet to kind of react to in terms of like there's progress, but you know, how much, right? How much progress, right? How much improvement in the different categories in terms of academics and the other metrics they follow will we see? So we'll get we need to make a decision in our budget process about do we want to go any further, right? So we'll get just 1 more quarter of data is basically kind of like that's what we're going to get, and then we'll be kind of in that decision making phase. So I guess, how much more detail do you think realistically we will get? I mean, it's encouraging that like, okay, for the students who participated, the two who I guess were seniors, like they graduated, but that's obviously again, this kind of a small group. I guess this
Mhm.
year they'll get more, like if that continues, great, but we won't do that until the end of the school year, things like that.
Right, the vendor shares a lot of optimism about the program.
Mhm.
Open Doors is really excited about what they've seen, and anecdotally and qualitative data wise, they see that this is making a big impact on the students served. And I wish that I had more quantitative information at this time. Timing wise, if we were to open some kind of application, we would probably want to do that in the spring. So that an award could be made for this vendor or another to be delivering programming in July without interrupting the service. And so there's not a clear way to address that tricky timing piece that I mentioned.
I would be interested in hearing from our school partners what they're seeing and their experience is
Mhm.
with this program. I think that would be valuable information.
I'm aware that Asheville City Schools is currently doing some resource mapping, looking at all of the dozens of community-based partners that they work with to try to understand what that looks like from a bigger picture perspective. I've not had specific questions with either school system about this program, but that seems like information that we could gather and bring back.
Yeah, thank you. That would be helpful.
Well, I would definitely want to get as much information as we can as this is going ahead, as we get more into the budget process. If, if we have some more details and data and it's encouraging, I mean, I would definitely be open to, continuing this, because it's my sense from what I'm hearing today is that, while we'll have some more information by this spring, it would really be over like, and if it had another year, then we would probably have a much better kind of data set to evaluate. Like, hey, wow, this is such a good idea, such an innovative approach, and we're really seeing the results that we would hope for from it. It's my sense that we won't have as much data as we would probably want this year. So, but I definitely would want to see what can be shared. I mean, I was definitely an advocate for this idea. There's a lot of tutoring and mentoring programs all around the country. What the Reach Group in DC is doing is highly innovative in a number of different regards. A lot of the tutoring kind of programs that go on around the country, you basically look for a lot of your best and brightest students to kind of be tutors, right? and that makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. Part of what Reach was the kind of the innovation around the Reach model is that they actually sought out kids who were like older students, high school students who were themselves really struggling academically, and they make them the tutors, right? And so it's kind of like, and from their work that's been going on longer, they see that like the tutors gain a lot academically as well as the younger kids who they're tutoring. So it's a very innovative kind of a way of thinking about this work. So I appreciate the updates. Look forward to learning more. And again, I would be, as we get more into it, if the data shows it's tracking in a way that we would hope, then I would be open to some kind of continuation, but would want to study this in more detail as part of that decision-making process.
Yep, that makes sense. And keep in mind, we have options. It doesn't have to be another 3-year award either. So if we need a little bit more time to get more data.
Sure. Other questions or thoughts on this for now?
I did ask Rachel to give us a real quick, last year's budget, one of our priorities was around school consolidation. I've asked Rachel to lead that effort on the county side, so I was asked her if she can give a quick update on where we are with that process as well.
Yep. So while I'm here with commissioners, you last heard from me in October, on October 17th, about the school consolidation feasibility study. That's when this board voted to officially accept the role of lead entity for that study, after being asked by the Asheville City School Board and Buncombe County School Board to do so. Being lead means we have responsibility for contracting with a firm to complete the study. So what has happened since then, we formed a project team, a multidisciplinary project team that has a lot of really diverse perspectives. 20 something members as nominated by the county manager and each superintendent, with equity, data, communications, HR, facilities, finance and budget, a lot of perspectives from staff at our 3 institutions, as well as people who represent principal, teacher, parent, and student voice. So that team has worked together to create to collaboratively create a scope of work for the request for proposals. That RFP will be issued tomorrow. So watch your emails for a copy coming your way soon. That will be open until January 18th. And so that keeps us on track to bring back to your board in March of 2024, a recommended award. Have the work begin in April to be completed by December, so that we can turn the final report in to the state, to the General Assembly by the following February of 25. Yep.
Any questions or comments for Rachel?
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to give a quick update on the homeowner grant program established in fiscal year 22. Health and Human Services reported 1,263 recipients in fiscal year 22. That number dropped to 721 last year, using about 72% of the budget. With about a month left, there have been a bit over 600 recipients this year. Additionally, with demand for other services ramping up, Health and Human Services is contracted for outside assistance to determine eligibility for this program. So as we move forward in the budget process, are there any thoughts about the homeowner grant program?
Sorry, John, could you repeat that last thing you said about the criteria that HHS is looking at?
Oh, I said additionally, with their demand for other services ramping up, so you saw earlier the curve up for FNS services and Medicaid expansion, they've actually had to contract out the determination of eligibility part.
Okay.
That they have to hire
And
contract staff to do
who's doing that?
They have a subcontractor supervised by Economic Services.
And how much does that cost?
The full contract was for $40,000. I don't know how much of that they've actually used. That's how much they obligated for the contract.
So there was a pretty sharp reduction from 22 to 23. And what was the primary driver around that?
That was when had a lot to do with the reassessment, with the revaluation and increased tax for folks in low income homeowners.
That would be the reval was in 21. So
Yeah.
initially in 2022, when it was new, I think that's when we had the most uptick.
So people are like, oh, my taxes are going up. Oh, and there's this program that can help with that.
Correct.
So there was more interest in it that year.
Correct.
But we did also tighten up the criteria too, right? So I'm also just kind
We
of
did-
curious
you
about like, how
did-
many people wouldn't have qualified because of it was more restrictive, right?
I think we actually loosened the criteria when we went.
We created some criteria about how much could be held,
Liquid assets.
like how much holdings you had outside of your regular
Yes.
income. No, I'm not certain that they did put that in the application process or make that public, but I don't know how much we were actually delving into people's financials to determine eligibility. Right. So it was a self-report.
just to throw this in the conversation, I think as long as, you know, we are continuing to, try to mitigate ways that there are disparities happening through the reappraisal process, that are disproportionately impacting lower income homeowners. To me, I mean, you know, this continues to feel like sort of a mitigation strategy to reduce the impact of those disparities. So I would support us continuing to move forward with the strategy sort of unless and until we can be certain that the methodology we're using on reappraisal or sort of how that's actually, if it's not a methodology question, sort of how it's actually happening, is not having a disproportionate impact.
We can bring an update once the year is complete.
And we'll also bring an update on where we are with looking at those strategies and the methodology to be used for property reappraisal. One of the things that Keith is working on right now would be to find a firm that can do that equity lens into our methodology and into our subsystems. So we're working on that now. So as soon as we can get some answers, we can bring that forward.
And the $40,000 that we subcontract out to administer the program, is that, now that we're doing it that way rather than doing it in-house, does that represent really all of the costs to the county to do this? Or is there still a fair amount of kind of in-house stuff that we have to do in addition to what the contractor?
There has to be
does?
supervised, like the contract has to be and the contract subcontractor is being supervised by HHS staff. And we still have to do the administrative work of cutting checks and figuring out who to pay, because we do not pay the individual. We either pay down their taxes or we pay utilities or other expenses.
So there's still a fair amount of work. The contractor is just vetting their
The eligibility.
eligibility, and that's all they're doing is vetting their eligibility. So we're spending $40,000 just to vet their eligibility.
Correct.
Yep. I still like this. I think it's to me, part of my concern is just the amount of resources we invest relative to the public benefit that we're getting out to the families and individuals who benefit from it. I think it's a good idea, but that's still my concerns, that we either need to make it a more robust program so that the public benefit that's being achieved is worth all this overhead costs that we're incurring, or we need to reduce the overhead costs we're incurring by making it somehow a more efficient system. I would be open to either of those possibilities, but if other groups came to us and said, hey, I've got this great idea for how to benefit the community, and it's going to do and it's going to be 40% overhead, we would say, it is a good idea, but that's not cost effective for the county taxpayers to do that. So we would hold other groups to that kind of standard. I think we should apply it to ourselves too. So. Any other thoughts on this? We have to figure this out today, but we'll talk about it as we go through the budget multiple times, I'm sure. So any other thoughts on this? All right. Thanks for the updates. Appreciate flagging it.
And then the last update I have for you is septic repair. Permits and inspections manage the septic repair program and complete 9 projects in fiscal year 23 using over 90% of the budgeted funding. They actually report very little administrative time required and are currently accepting applications for this year. Any questions on the septic repair?
Yeah.
To also add, we are in the beginning stages of both the Green Bank and Clean Water Fund initiatives, and we will bring updates on those items when we have something to report.
All right, so I'd like to close this out today. First, ask you to think about, out of all the topics that were discussed throughout today, what stands out to you or what surprises you?
And Taylor talked to us about this a little bit, but I guess I'm interested in like. Is there a little bit more analysis around? The level of service and the calls that they're getting? Is there something unique that's happening? Is it just related to the aging population or whatever? Is there more detail that commissioners might benefit from?
We can certainly ask.
I don't think that was your question, but that's what,
No,
Sure.
that's great. Just anything that
yeah.
really stands out to you.
I will just reiterate what I said earlier, which is we have to take care of our internal house now. And seeing these numbers and projects show us that we have not necessarily decided to focus on some of those things that we desperately need to be focused on moving forward. I appreciate the work that went into this to make that so I sometimes seeing it in black and white is easier than just hearing it.
Mhm.
Commissioner Wells.
So turn on with what Parker said. Yeah, just looking at the workforce growth and everything, that was pretty eye-opening over that time and those needs. And so I'm definitely interested in knowing more about that and kind of a projection of where you see, because we know we're a growing county, right? And those services are growing. So just having a good understanding of that and where we're projecting that to continue to go will be useful as well.
Commissioner Weiss.
You know, what I like is that on some of the issues we're discussing now, you know, in the past, because of what was going on, we've been kicking the can sort of down the road. But I think now we've finally come to the conclusion that we've hit the wall and we got to deal with it. I think going forward, this is what we're gonna do. And I didn't see any surprises or anything in here. Nothing surprised me. But we got to work cut out.
Commissioner Newman.
I thought it was a really good budget session.
Yeah.
So thanks to everyone who helped put it together. Great data, like really, very relevant and useful information, right? So really can very productive and like gets us prepared to go through this budget process, I think in a really productive way. So I don't know if anything else to add. I think that it's you know, it's both some great planning around some of the core services that are for fundamental to county government, as well as some of the areas of, you know, kind of innovation that are not necessarily required of state government by county government, by the state, but are things that our community wants to see us making progress on. So I think it's a great outlook on both the basic services as well as the areas of being responsive to kind of the community's vision for where we want to go in the world. I really appreciate it.
So our next steps as the county, and we have been gathering information from departments. Our departments have a full budget request due to us by the end of January. And we'll be coming back to you in March for our first of what we have 3 budget work sessions scheduled to talk about what our expenditure budget is looking like at that time. And so do you have any final thoughts for us as we move into this next phase of budgeting?
I think coming back to us with some of the data that we talked about, right, and being able, especially looking at the financials, that's really important for us and understanding that growth and the revenues and looking at the reserve policy and kind of best practices. I think all that will help inform this process.
Discussions with that, a lot better than the year before that. Team effort, but they got a little bit further this year.
think they, although they didn't jump on the idea of, hey, let's come up with a multi-year plan and do it now. I think they did in some of the informal meetings we had, they did express that I think they also would like to come into this process such that we're going into this on the same page rather than them coming in late and just making some big ask. No, we cannot possibly meet.
Right.
And then having it be this kind of negotiated, this, us versus them kind, it's not exactly like that, but we all know what the dynamics like there. So I think they're also hoping that they can engage earlier and come up with a plan that is realistic for us both to be able to support. So I hope that happens too. We'll see.
Thank you very much. That is all we have
All right.
today.
Good.
All right. Appreciate everyone's work on this. Great job. We're adjourned.